Welcome back, everyone. So I guess my piece is between Enrique's piece on culture, Georgina's piece on leadership, may not always be the best kind of leadership, and Konstantin's piece on conscious business. So I thought I'd try and perhaps bridge those two, talking about business and brand, which are, I guess, the other two elements to that, but particularly from a leadership perspective. So when we think about living organizations and we think about the systemic nature of that thinking, one of the things that we often think about there is sustainability and thinking about businesses and brands, leaders that build businesses and brands as a force for good. So that's really what I'm going to focus on. Joanne mentioned a couple of the businesses that I'm in, and the only reason I put these up is I'm going to mention these a little bit later. The two on your left, the Global Center for Conscious Leadership I co-founded just over 3 years ago with a partner, Gina Hayden. I'm going to talk about Gina because she has written a book, and she was invited here to speak on that book, but unfortunately in South Africa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and some insights on conscious leadership. As Joanne said, I'm also involved in Pinea 3, and I'm also part of two networks, one which is Conscious Capitalism, which Konstantin is going to cover later, so I'm only going to make the links on that one. And the Madinga Group is an international think tank of brand experts, which runs something called Brands with a Conscience Awards. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about that, because we talk a lot about business and business as a force for good, but brands, of course, are also and can be a very important force for good. All of these have something in common, which is all of these entities and the people that are involved in them think systemically. They think not short-term, mid-term, they think long-term. They're interested in legacy. They are interested in the sustainability of businesses and brands for the future and for the common good of humanity and for future generations. I like this quote from Ed Freeman. We need red blood cells to live the same way a business needs profits to live. But the purpose of life is more than to make red blood cells. The same way the purpose of business is more than simply to generate profits. And we often talk about the 4 Ps: purpose, people, planet, and profit. And this really is a piece around that. It's perhaps since 2008 and 9 when we had the crash, people have begun to look perhaps more about sustainability and thinking beyond profits. But we could say in some areas, particularly in banking, there is still some way to go, in the finance sector in general. So what I'm going to share now is some of the thinking, the networks that are involved, the leaders that are perhaps leading the way. You'll know other leaders, certainly in other countries. I'm only going to name a few here. And the companies that are also investing in this. Conscious leadership and a way of thinking about living organizations, for often it's quite abstract for people. And I myself do wonder, is it a belief I hold? Is it a belief that others hold? Is it a movement? You know, are we creating a movement here? People talk a lot about conscious capitalism being a movement. It happens also to be an organization. Or is it just part of natural evolution? Is that just where we are in the cycle? And I hold that thought. I don't know the answer to that, but maybe some of what I'm going to talk about may inspire some thoughts around that, I hope. A nice quote here from Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General. Leaders are making sustainability a core part of business strategy now. Now we need business leaders everywhere to make business a force for good. Together we can respond to the urgency of our global challenges and build a better tomorrow. And I think this is where strategy, culture, leadership, and brand all play a really important role about helping to meet these global challenges of the future. Conscious capitalism put up a number of years ago a model, and this is kind of where it links to the presentations that have just been and the presentations that are coming up. We talk a lot about higher purpose when we talk about being a force for good. Some people call conscious leadership a calling. It's not a job, it's not a career, it's something that comes from deep within. It's like an inherent knowing. We talk about culture, and we talked a lot about culture change earlier. Brand is also linked to stakeholder issues. We talk about clients first often, or employees first. We talk about community. We talk about other stakeholders and shareholders, investors, of course. And we talk about leadership. And conscious capitalism believes that all of these 4 elements are important to develop a conscious business. So those businesses that are perhaps defined as or aiming to be a conscious business have to think about all of these areas. What is their purpose as an organization? Are they developing a conscious, caring culture? Do they have leaders that are aware and think systemically? And how is their stakeholder management? Are they developing a win-win culture for all? These are some of the leaders that are leading the way. You see there, I think, towards your left, a lady, Arianna Huffington. Arianna Huffington used to run the Huffington Post. She founded the Huffington Post. An extraordinary lady in the fact that she has really, really contributed to the growth of this, if it's a movement. She is a conscious leader in herself. She is now organized and running a business called Thrive. I don't know if any of you have read her book, Arianna Huffington Thrive, but she has now built a business around the well-being of organizations. She's working with very large multinationals at the moment, building a sense of business as a force for good. Paul Polman, on the right of Arianna Huffington, is the CEO of Unilever, again, another big business that is really, really committed to sustainable business and business as a force for good. On the right, you have Richard Branson, who is a leader in his own way through his businesses, but also founded and invested in a network called the B Team, which again, if any of you go online, the B Team, just bteam.org, again, interesting bunch of people. Many of these have invested their time and energy in B Team, again, as a force for good, businesses as a force for good. John Mackey, I'll talk about in a minute, the CEO of Whole Foods, also written a very interesting book. Mo Ibram here sold his IT business for, I think it was something like 4 billion, and now is one of the largest philanthropists coming out of Africa and really helping to invest in the premise of conscious business and conscious business principles in some of the third world countries. So these are just some of the leaders that are putting their weight and their energy behind business as a force for good. I mentioned John Mackey, CEO of Whole Foods. Konstantin is going to talk a lot about a gentleman called Raj Sisodia, an academic in this field. John Mackey and Raj Sisodia wrote the book Conscious Capitalism, which I prefer the other bit of the title, actually, which is Liberating the Heroic Spirit of Business. And it would be nice if we had more businesses, perhaps, that had heroic spirits amongst them. But John Mackey says, and I think this is part of what I want to talk about now, is he says a business can only be as conscious as its leader. And that's interesting because a business can raise its principles, its ethics, the way it does business, when it has a leader that is also growing in his or her own self-awareness. So if you have a leader that is curious about the world, thinks beyond the me to the we, thinks beyond the organization to the community, to the outer world, to the planet, they actually can be bringing conscious principles into the business, creating a conscious culture. Henri talked about the length of CEOs, and now often our CEOs only have a 3-year tenancy. This is often a challenge because what happens is a business can raise its kind of frequency almost, or its operating system in the broadest context with one leader. And then another leader can come in who may not be so self-aware. And of course, the frequency of the organization then actually can take a step back. So it's never always, I'm getting to a point, this is another whole philosophical debate, but consciousness is continual. So you don't just go, oh, I'm a conscious business, fantastic. You know, now I can go home. No, I mean, there's all a continuum, and you move forward and back. And so that's part of the continuum. These presentations are shared, and this is just some of the reading that is useful and I have found interesting as part of this story of conscious leadership, organizations as living systems, sustainable business. And I think Firms of Endearment, which is here, Raj Sisodia's book, Constantine, I think we'll mention a little bit later. These are some of the businesses that are involved, not just in conscious capitalism, but some of the networks that I talked about. There are many, and there are many more, and there are certainly many here in Spain, Catalonia, that are part of this list. And by the way, some of these you may be looking at going, yeah, Google, yeah, it has a conscious culture. A lot of people who work there would say its leaders develop a very caring culture, but hey, it didn't pay all its taxes. So, you know, how ethical is that? Well, is that a conscious business? So we have these debates continually. And some of these organizations themselves would say we've made mistakes. That's part of leadership, is to own up to those mistakes. The question is, we're all going to make mistakes, but how do you act on that? How do you respond to a mistake? It's not just the businesses. Many of you here today, I think, are probably coaches, consultants. This, to me, is really interesting. And again, there are many more of these. But this is an evolving ecosystem. These are organizations, networks, not-for-profits that are all supporting the idea of business and brands as a force for good. You've got everyone from sort of Deepak Chopra, a foundation at one level, to the B Team, to a blueprint for better business, which in the UK Prince Charles is a part of. So there's a lot of industries, people that are all beginning to coalesce, and we call it kind of the idea of lighting little fires all over the place. Yeah, it's actually, some of these organizations do network together, which is really great, and we all co-create and collaborate. So, what is conscious leadership? We think it's less about adding skills and capabilities and knowledge to your leadership style, although that is very important. We believe it's more about an almost upgrading of an operating system. You know, kind of think about when you upgrade your operating system as a computer or my mobile phone, which I'm just about to do in dread. But the reality is that it is more about upgrading the total operating system of your leadership. Okay, so that's what conscious leadership is about. Why do we need it? Complexity, it's everywhere at the moment, and conscious leaderships need to think in multiple perspectives. They need to be able to not just hold one worldview. And there's some people at the moment in the world that are possibly holding one worldview, but conscious leaders are the ability to think in multiple perspectives. And there is no just I, it is the we. Transparency and social media is having an impact on transparency. So leaders that are open, Enrique talked about that earlier, people that understand it is important that their actions have an impact on not just themselves, their teams, their organizations, but also the community and society as a whole. They recognize that we need to move from competition, having a competitive culture, to one that is collaborative. When we co-create, we innovate. And Georgina, you were just talking there before around, there's people that when you're a narcissist, you kind of think you know everything. This is the opposite, I guess, of that. It's moving away from the me to the we and saying, actually, all the best ideas, when we co-create, we innovate. And significance. And also, people now, a lot of people are moving beyond the premise of profits, as I said earlier. And what is the purpose of an organization? And is the work that I am doing meaningful? Can I make a difference to the world? And so conscious leaders tend to have a sense of calling about what they do, as I said earlier, and a deep meaning and purpose. And I want to put millennials in here, because Gina and I, as we were working through some research that we'd done, and as Gina was writing the book, my colleague Gina, she said to me, it's so weird, but the millennials feel like they've already had the upgrade to their operating system. They already think in systems. Maybe that's partly because they've grown up in an interconnected world through the internet. But these guys are actually already connected. They think in a connected world. They think systemically. So in a way, I mean, I know some of the millennials that I've talked to and interviewed. I wasn't thinking anything like those guys were thinking 20 years. Now, that just may be me. Certainly could be. But actually, I think millennials, and in a really positive way, and gives us hope, that the millennials, I think, are the people that are really going to change the face of leadership going forward. This is the book that Gina has recently written and has just come out, How to Lead Successfully in a World That's Waking Up. We hope that it's waking up. I think we have significant challenges in the world right now and have for many centuries, but it's a challenge. And what we believe on these 4 areas is there are 4 areas of conscious leader that we identified. Self-mastery, which is those leaders that recognize they are not the sum total of their ego, that they choose consciously the decisions and actions they make rather than automatic response. Conscious relating is when they foster connections in organizations between each other and teams, and they are open to radical partnering. So people like P&G are into radical partnering and innovating their products and services. They also have systems insight, so they see patterns and connections beyond their teams and organizations, and they can link people together. They take the macro and the long-term view. And collective responsibility. They see business, life, and society as a whole. So they tend to think about how can they spot things that need support, actions, investment, either as an individual, if they're a philanthropist, or a business. How can they act on that? How can they put their attention to that? And what is their legacy? So these are the 4 areas that are key qualities that we would say of a conscious leader. These are some of the leaders that you will, if you get Gina's book, read about. Sudhakar Ram thinks about multiple perspectives. He's a company, an IT, very successful leading IT business called Maztec. The only interesting I wanted to say about him, which is interesting as a leader, was that he went to Otto Scharmer's Presencing Institute. He took his whole team to the Otto Scharmer Presencing Institute. And when he came out, he decided to have a flat structure and a self-managing organization, similar to if you have read Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux. He has gone down that route. He lost a lot of people in the process, which Enrique talked about. When you make change, sometimes you lose people. But the organization is thriving, and after 2010, when they had challenges, they are now significantly leading the way in their field. Bob Fishman from RHD, a resource company. Laura Roberts from Pantheon, which is a conscious chemical company. We have Dominic Sawela from South Africa, and one thing I just want to make a point about him again, an interesting area. Dominic coaches and trains and develops all his people in his organization, not for success, but for significance. Because he believes success is about targets and significance is about making a difference. So these people are kind of rethinking some of their premises. We have Sally Ann Ramney, who is an environmentalist. She's worked with 3 presidents in the US. Lorna Davis from Danone, who is an innovator and makes the links between all of the innovations that Danone are developing, has a great title, Chief Manifesto Catalyst. And lastly, Tom Chi. Tom was part of Google X, part of Google Glasses. Tom and his team either think in timeframes of 2 weeks or 1,000 years. That's the only 2 things he looks at. He says, I'm either interested in what's happening immediately or the outcome of my actions and what's going to be happening in the world and how can I impact humanity for the next 1,000 years. I'm probably just about on time. Is that, Joanne? A couple of minutes?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So people always say, how can you spot leaders in organizations? How can you spot these people? So these are some of the things that we've put together. One is, are they open to emotional intelligence? Are they open to development? Have they got high levels of curiosity, self-inquiry? Do they link their values with the organization? Are they looking for authenticity and coherence in the way they manage and develop? Have they gone beyond the me to the we? So are they trying to create common programs, common projects, common thinking, knowledge sharing? Do they take a stand about something? You know, when they believe in something, are they prepared to take a stand? Are they integrated in their thinking? So are they knowledge sharing and pulling ideas together? Enrique talked about diversification earlier. Again, are they open to that? Are they thinking about stakeholders, not again from a competitive, we need to win? What does it take for us to win? But how can we all win in that premise? And lastly, how do they link their business to society? How do they find a role for their business, a meaningful role in society and the planet as a whole? Lastly, just want to talk about millennials. These are the things that millennials are important to millennials. It's very much about immediacy. They want to see contribution on two fronts. They want to make a contribution, but the organizations that they now seek to work in, they want to see what contribution that organization is making to society and the sustainability of the planet. Things have to be relevant. Everything has to be connected. We know they have a really strong sense of belonging, and values and principles and ethics are becoming more important to them. And lastly, they have upgraded their operating system. They are natural systems thinkers. And it's not cool, they say, to be the kind of leader that many of the organizations that we have today are. So they want to be a different type of leader. This looks like a highly complicated map. It is. It is called the Conscious Leadership Blueprint. It's on our website, and I'm sure Joanne will be putting these across. The only important thing here is that this maps to the 4 areas I talked about earlier. So top left, self-awareness, something called SQ. So we know EQ is about emotional intelligence, SQ is about spiritual intelligence, higher purpose, EQ, emotional intelligence, systems thinking, and leadership of the future. What this shows is the interconnectedness of all of the capacities that a conscious leader needs to attain to. And you can start anywhere on this map because people develop different needs, different capabilities, different interests, different passions about being a leader. But when you look at how interconnected all of those elements are, and we talk about living systems here, it's natural that actually every part of the premise of growing and developing as a leader is interconnected. Okay? So if I have a higher purpose, it also links to my ability to think in an open way, in a curious way about my own self-development. When I think about my self-development, I have to think about how I relate to others, systems thinking. When I think about the system, I'm also thinking about long-term responsibility. So I am thinking as the leader of the future. Leaders of the future think about organizations as a living system. And lastly, brands with a conscience, those brands that are also thinking in that way. A recent book, Brands with a Conscience, has just come out, which is interesting. These are some of the brand leaders. Again, these are more brands and interesting, because before we're talking corporate companies, now we're looking at brands. 17 case studies right across the board from India, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Italy. But all of that said, it is an evolving process. And as I say, I think it's always, we move up and down this scale. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting somewhere, I don't know about you guys, and then, 2 weeks later I think, Jesus, am I still thinking that way? God, I've got so far to go. And I think that's what happens with leaders and organizations. You go a little bit more up and maybe you move a little bit more back again. So I think we're all on a continuum. We're all a living system. So that's the presentation. The last thing I just wanted to leave with, which I love this quote from Robert Kennedy from 1968. The gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning. neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile.
Thank you.